So when I was in graduate school, when I first got to graduate school, literally the first day I went in to meet my advisor and sit down, and the first thing you do as you're working to a PhD is you get a master's along the way. And so first day of graduate school, I'm in his office and he's like, well, what do you want your master's thesis to be on? And I have just gotten to graduate school and I truthfully don't know. So I'm like, well, maybe something on the Nixon administration and China. And the first thing my advisor asked me is, well, do you speak Chinese? And I do not speak Chinese. And he said, that's not going to work. You have to come up with something else. So I was like, okay, well, let me do some reading on the Nixon administration and see what I'm interested in. Because I'm fundamentally interested in how domestic policy intersects with foreign relations. So I did some reading and I got really interested in Nixon's policy about détente with the Soviet Union, but not necessarily the policy itself, rather the tremendous amount of discord that arose from the public around it. I was very surprised to see conservatives were really mad about it, and scientists were really mad about it, and labor unions were mad. Everybody was mad. But I was really surprised to see that evangelical Christians were mad. Because at the time, when I thought about evangelical Christians and their policy issues, I thought, gosh, they're interested in hot button issues like prayer in school. There are IRS rules for keeping their schools sort of tax-free, and abortion. And what I found is that evangelicals are actually quite interested in foreign policy. And so as I was doing research for my master's thesis, I kept finding interesting tidbits about these groups. And I said, I really don't know much about evangelicals in the foreign policy context. I want to know more. I took a class on Pentecostalism, which was fascinating. And then I started to do research, and I generated an idea, a sort of hypothesis about what was driving evangelical engagement on foreign policy issues in the 1970s. Because I hadn't seen much of it too much earlier in a concentrated way, but in the 70s they really come together. What I found through my research, going through a lot of different archives, was that these groups, in part because of their missionary agenda, the fact that they're all over the world, that they're trying to evangelize to people and share their faith, they become really active in promoting ideas about human rights that would allow them to evangelize. So, for example, they're very concerned about relations with the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union is a repressive society and won't let people practice their religion freely. So they become advocates for human rights in the Soviet Union. But they interestingly also then support very repressive right-wing dictators in places like Central America or the apartheid regime in South Africa, because those leaders are promoting anti-communism and are supporting at least nominal religious freedom. And they become allies in the fight against not just communism, but the fight against religion. So they advocate for trade policy or military aid to very repressive regimes in the name of human rights. And so that's sort of the genesis of the book, and the core argument is that their missionary interests shaped their foreign policy agenda, and that they become very effective at shaping policy in the Reagan administration around that vision of human rights for them being the right to evangelize and to talk about their faith.